one of the most powerful channelers in the Age of Legends. On par with the dragon Lews Therin Telamon, Elon Morin Tedronai was a highly respected philosopher, theologian, and author until researchers at Column Dawn University drilled a hole through the pattern of reality and into the Dark One's prison, allowing him to touch and influence the world. Fascinated by this primordial being and the enormity of his power, Elon studied the Dark One and theorized that the Wheel of Time was a cycle in which humanity and the forces of light fought an unending struggle to keep this great evil from escaping captivity. He also believed Lews Therin Telamon was a part of this cycle, constantly reborn in new bodies as a champion of the light, often standing in opposition to the Dark One, though he also thought there were times when he fell to corruption and joined the Shadow. Developing a nihilistic view on the fate of the universe, Elon concluded that since the Dark One was an eternal being who could never be destroyed, the forces of light would have to win every single encounter for the rest of time to ensure their continued existence. The Dark One, however, need only win once in order to break the wheel and remake the world in his image. Therefore, the Dark One's victory was inevitable, making continued opposition foolish and futile. Unwilling to fight for a losing cause, Elon Morin Tedronai was the only one of the Forsaken to join the Shadow out of a philosophical and intellectual principle rather than greed or desire for immortality. Seeking to share these conclusions with his peers, Elon publicly proclaimed his allegiance to the Dark One in the Hall of Servants, shocking his fellow Aes Sedai. Now called Ishamael, meaning Betrayer of Hope, he quickly rose to prominence among the Forsaken and Friends of the Dark, named Chief Captain General of the Shadow, which made him the leader of their forces. Clashing with the dragon, at some point Ishamael was humbled in the Hall of Servants and defeated at the gates of the city Paradisen, leading him to further theorize about the cyclical nature of these confrontations, believing he too was a part of the pattern, destined to be reborn as a champion of darkness, just as the dragon stood for the light. Though the Dark One and 13 most powerful Forsaken were eventually defeated and imprisoned, Ishamael was only partially sealed away, resulting in his release from captivity roughly 40 years every millennia, beginning with the initial period following the War of the Power. The only one of the 13 Forsaken to remain free in those early years, he continued his vendetta against Lews Therin, tracking him down to his home where he hoped for a final battle between them. However, because the Dark One's counterstroke tainted saidin, the dragon was already mad, wandering around in a helpless daze after killing his own family with the One Power. Disgusted by the state of his enemy, Ishamael used the true power of the Dark One to heal Lews Therin's mind so he could understand what he did and fight their final battle. But when the dragon realized he killed his own family, his grief and rage could not be contained, killing himself in a massive explosion of saidin, which reshaped the lands surrounding his home, creating Dragonmount and the island later known as Tar Valon. Robbed of the final confrontation he sought, Ishamael was forced to wait thousands of years until the pattern repeated and the dragon was reborn. Originally known as Arid Mosenel, the Forsaken Rahvin was a great Aes Sedai, nearly equal in raw power to Ishamael and Lews Therin, but less prestigious and well-known. An expert manipulator, skilled in the art of compulsion, Rahvin preferred diplomacy and persuasion to warfare, gaining a reputation for caution and meticulous schemes. Turning to the Dark One out of a desire for power, he held both military and political offices, proving an able administrator, governor, and negotiator, able to convince several territories to surrender without need for violent invasion. Despite his many talents, Rahvin was a hedonist with a weakness for women, causing him to sometimes shirk responsibilities to spend time with his lovers. Known as Barid Bel Madar prior to his betrayal, the man later called Demandred was a powerful channeler, but also jealous, petty, and solemn, considered the angriest of all the Forsaken, though he hid it behind a mask of calm. Joining the Shadow out of hatred for Lews Therin, Demandred's desire for vengeance grew throughout his life, as he was in constant competition with the dragon, but never able to best him in any area. A prestigious author who held high offices, every one of his achievements were surpassed by his rival, even holding true in their romantic endeavors, as Demandred was in love with Ileana Morel, who ultimately chose Lews Therin as her husband. At the start of the War of Power, Demandred proved himself an expert military commander, in some ways equaling the dragon, but once again his talents were not enough, as Lews Therin was named commander over the forces of light. Enraged by this decision, Demandred believed the armies of light were destined to lose under the leadership of his foolish, overcautious rival, and so joined the Shadow, where he formed a personal army called the 80-1, similar to Lews Therin's supporters the 100 Companions. As one of the most powerful Forsaken, Demandred exacted cruel revenge upon his enemies, feeding 2 whole cities to Trollocs because they slighted him in the past. Winning a number of victories, Demandred was one of the generals leading the final push to defeat the forces of light when Lews Therin embarked upon his mission to Sheol Ghul. Originally named Tel Jenen Aelinsar, the man later called Sammael was one of the greatest athletes of his era, known as an expert archer and world champion in the sport of swords. A friend of Lews Therin, Sammael proved himself an excellent warrior and tactician, specializing in defensive strategies, but ultimately joined the Dark One out of a growing jealousy for the dragon, who was selected as commander of their forces. Possessing a scar along his face, given to him by Lews Therin, Sammael refused to have it healed, instead using it as a constant reminder of his hatred and desire for vengeance. Preferring warfare to administration, the territories he governed were neglected and so poorly run, his people routinely died of disease and hunger. His soldiers, however, were treated well, given all the food, supplies, and medical attention they needed, in the same way Sammael maintained his equipment during his days as a sportsman, ensuring they would not fail him when needed. Despite believing himself superior to Lews Therin, he was never able to defeat him in a direct confrontation, but did win a number of other victories, making him one of the leading generals in the final offensive that nearly defeated the forces of light. Known previously as Ishar Morid Twain, the Forsaken Aginor was one of their most powerful channelers, but also less ambitious than the others, preventing him from achieving greater status among his colleagues. Known as a great biologist before his fall to the Dark One, Aginor's only real desire was to have the freedom necessary to further his scientific research, as many of his experiments were considered unethical by the Hall of Servants. Pledging himself to the Shadow, he was granted all the liberty and resources he wanted, resulting in the creation of fast-breeding human-animal hybrids called Trollocs, which went on to serve as the backbone of the Dark One's armies. Aginor was so adept at genetic engineering, he created many of the Shadow Spawn races, including Myrddraal, Drakkar, and others, which continued to plague humanity beyond the War of Power for thousands of years to come. A poor military commander, Aginor remained in the background throughout the war and won little glory for himself, but was nonetheless the deadliest of all the Forsaken, as he was estimated to have sacrificed over 10,000 men, women, and children every day of the war to create his Shadow Spawn, in addition to the untold numbers they slaughtered while fighting. Born Eval Raman, the Forsaken Balthamel was once a noted historian specializing in vanished cultures, but failed to achieve greater prominence as his true passion was for gambling and women, spending much of his time in places of ill repute. Possessing an explosive temper and penchant for violence, he was lured to the Shadow with promises of eternal life, and served most ably by heading an extensive intelligence network. Responsible for some of the most heinous atrocities in the War of Shadow, he was known to create breeding camps for humans in order to provide a regular source of food for their Trolloc armies. Known previously as Joar Adam Nesosin, the Forsaken Asmodean was a famous but insecure musician who ultimately fell to the Shadow for the sake of immortality, which gave him an eternity to practice and improve his skills. As a governor over territories conquered by the Shadow, he regularly arrested artists and musical rivals in order to blind or maim them so they could never again use their talents. A twisted and cruel individual, Asmodean stilled his own Aes Sedai mother before giving her to a Myrddraal. Named Durham Liddell Cham, the Forsaken Balal was a legal advocate, master swordsman, and friend of Lews Therin in his previous life, once beating him in a game of stones. Though he started out fighting for the armies of light in the War of Power, he grew increasingly jealous of the dragon and so fell to the shadow, becoming one of their greatest manipulators, tacticians, warriors, and generals. In addition to his military prowess, Balal served as a governor who distinguished himself through extreme violence and cruelty. Among his many accomplishments, Balal was one of the Forsaken who raised the Hall of Servants and was involved in the final offensive which nearly defeated the armies of light. Born Mirin Aranail, the Forsaken Lanfear was considered one of the most beautiful women to ever live, and was once the lover of Lews Therin Telamon until he ended things, believing she cared more about status than their relationship. As a highly reputed researcher at the University of Colum Dawn, Lanfear was one of those responsible for creating the Bore which allowed the Dark One's influence into the world. A selfish woman, only nominally loyal to the Dark One, her true allegiance was always to herself, and thus joined the Shadow to increase her power and one day win back the love of Lews Therin. The most powerful female Forsaken, surpassing even some of the men, she was a skilled dreamer, able to torture enemies in their sleep. Considering the dream world her domain, she used these skills to terrorize the people she governed, and to win a number of victories for the Shadow, but was nonetheless passed over for leadership, leading her to consider Ishamael an enemy ever seeking to supplant his position. Known previously as Nameen, Damindar Bawan, the Forsaken Semirhage was one of the most gifted restorers in the world, able to heal any wound or illness short of death. However, she was also one of the most cruel and sadistic women in the Hall of Servants, using her position to purposely torture and kill those she deemed unworthy of life. When her colleagues discovered what she was doing, they threatened punishment, and so she abandoned the light to join the Shadow, where she was free to commit all the cruelty she wanted. Serving as an average military general, her greatest contributions were as the head of a spy network, while also governing a number of territories with a unique level of abuse and horror, performing terrible medical experiments on her people, becoming so feared and infamous, prisoners committed suicide rather than face her wrath. At some point, she was taken captive by the forces of light, but her reputation was so fearsome, she intimidated her guards into helping her escape. Hating Aes Sedai most of all, she reserved the worst punishments for her former colleagues, using her knowledge of the human body to inflict unimaginable pain. Born Sain Tarasind, the Forsaken Mesaana was a professor at the prestigious University of Colum Dawn, a career she hated as she originally applied to become a researcher but was ultimately rejected. Enraged by her failure to pursue the path she desired, Mesaana turned to the Shadow, where she served as an adequate military general, but highly effective and efficient governor, focusing her efforts on the children of her territories, using them as tools of oppression, fear, and cruelty. Becoming known as Mesaana's children, they were taught to bully each other, pick on those who were different, inform on their parents, and commit acts of ruthless violence. After the defeat of the Dark One, these children formed roaming gangs, which continued to wreak havoc for many years to come. Once called Kamaral Maradim Nindar, the Forsaken Graendal was a respected psychologist, famous for her ability to heal mental afflictions. Living by a strict minimalist and ascetic code, she believed humanity must cast off the shackles of vanity to embrace a life of simplicity, putting little value in appearance, clothing, and possessions. Though she was greatly admired for these practices, those who knew her were repelled by her arrogance and sense of moral superiority. In time, Graendal realized that the world would never live up to her standards, and so abandoned her beliefs to take on a new lifestyle, embracing values in direct opposition to what she previously espoused, engaging in vanity, debauchery, hedonism, and physical pleasure, with a great emphasis on looks and fashion, considered a woman of exceptional beauty. With this new mindset, she eventually joined the Shadow and gathered a harem of beautiful men and women to serve her as mindless slaves. Though she was not a military leader, she was an expert at mental manipulation, responsible for a great many victories and subversion efforts. While other Forsaken were more powerful and influential, the dragon reserved a special hatred for Graendal, as she killed the woman Yennet, who was dear to his heart. Born Lilen Moirel, the Forsaken Moghedien was an advisor of investments in her former life, until joining the Shadow to first serve as a spy working for Lews Therin Telamon. Sabotaging his efforts from the inside, she was eventually discovered and fled to create an extensive spy network for the forces of darkness. A master of the dream world, even surpassing the skills of Lanfear, Moghedien was responsible for some of their most successful sabotage schemes, said to have killed as many people as any military general, though her targets were often civilians rather than soldiers. Love The Wheel of Time or any other series? Then why not check out Audible, where they have the largest collection of audiobooks available. Sign up through the links below for regular membership and get a 30-day free trial, or else try Premium Plus for a 60-day trial and up to 3 free audiobooks. For those who prefer to read their stories, there is the Kindle Unlimited plan, where you get as many ebooks as you wish. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, narrated by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, along with the prequel novel and history book. A special thanks to all those who contribute to CivilizationEx, like Warden of the X, Sir Jeremiah Ironside of House Comcia, Warden of the X, Christ Walder, the Crimson Shadow, Warden of the X, Sir Darren of House Ashford, and Knight of Iron and Ice, Fred Heartless. If you'd like to help the channel, be sure to give a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and click on the links below, or else go to patreon.com/CivilizationEx, where you can gain early access to videos, vote on future content, and watch the Patreon-only series, Heroes of Lore and Legend.